Figures suggest that while our economy has created nearly 800,000 jobs in the last year or so, only 45,000, a tiny fraction of those, have gone to people under the age of 25. In other words, despite the fact so many young people need jobs, our economy just isn't creating those jobs for them. Kristal Duncan-Williams is the project lead at Youth Capital. Kristal, good afternoon to you. This strange situation in our country where the older you are, the more likely you are to have a job. If you're younger, the less likely you are to have a job. How has this happened?
Yeah, I think, it's been systemically building towards this for the last little while, but it's only when we started really delving into the numbers that we realize how dire it is. Even the latest quarterly labor force stats show that on average, young people's unemployment rate has been 20% more than their older counterparts. So when we say young, we mean, age 15 to 35. And it's because young people face such enormous barriers to entry when trying to enter the labor market. The cost of looking for work, not having the social networks to be able to even know about opportunities, and then lacking work experience. Young people so often tell us, I need work experience to get a job, but I need a job to get work experience. And how am I ever supposed to kind of overcome this conundrum that I keep being faced with? Even for entry-level jobs, young people are being asked for experience. And I think because just on a whole, our labor market is not growing at the pace needed to create enough jobs for everyone, young and old alike. What tends to happen is that I think employers are going for older hires because they're less risky, at least in the employer's eyes. And so young people perpetually are at the back of the queue of being hired.
It's also just there's such a small number of jobs available, right? I mean, if there was a much larger number of jobs available, if we had the unemployment rate, say, that some parts of Britain and Europe have, where they have record unemployment at the moment, record low unemployment, I mean, employers would be desperate for anyone.
Exactly. I mean, you often hear stories of a job ad at ShopRite to be a shelf packer where you need a matric. Now, you don't need a matric to pack shelves at ShopRite, but when you've got millions, literally, of people queuing up for any job, then employers can be as picky as they like. They can take older people, they can take more experienced people, they can ask for matric qualifications when it's not necessary, they can ask for maths and science on your matric certificate, which isn't necessary for the job. But they can be as picky as they like because they have a long line of people to choose from, and they know that, job seekers know that. And so it really sets particularly young people who don't have, as I said, this very critical work experience, it sets them up for disaster, which is why we really need programs that give young people an in and give them a little bit of work experience and exposure to the world of work, even if they're short-term opportunities.
Government keeps talking about creating jobs, and we know it's the biggest concern for young people. I'm sure it's the biggest concern for their parents too. Is there any sign that officials understand this problem? We have seen some interventions.
Yeah, just this morning, Stephen, we were reading up, the announcement that was made that the Presidential Youth Employment Fund is going to get, 360 billion or something. Then there's another announcement made in the Sunday Times this past week about, through UIF funding, another jobs program and training program being announced. And all I can say in relation to this is these are government interventions that are being released over the same time. One assumes ahead of elections they want to look good at, like, we're creating job opportunities. But there's no synchronicity, there's no synergy, and there's no overall strategic framework for how these different interventions that are using skills fund money, UIF money, so taxpayers' money, how these different programs are adding up to greater than the sum of their parts. I mean, if we think about the money that's been plowed into youth development over the last decade, it is astronomical. But where are the reports that call for the accountability in that? I think that's the question we need to be asking ourselves ahead of the elections. Which parties have a strategic way of creating jobs that's not just like we'll throw some money and we'll have some short-term opportunities in the end? That needs to be part of an overall plan that cut across the different departments. It can't be, left to each department to come up with its own flagship program, and then these different programs do not speak to each other and don't pathway young people to any kind of sustainable livelihood in the long run.
We have a Minister of Labour and Employment, Newzroom, and I've put it to him, actually, on this programme, and I've suggested to him that we hardly hear from him. Whenever unemployment figures come out, we hear from yourselves, we hear from unions, we hear from experts, we hear from everybody who's worried about it. We hear almost nothing from Newzroom, and he's the Minister of Labour and Employment. Is that a disappointment?
Yeah, it is, and when I have heard, ministers like himself and others speak, just recently I've been disappointed. Youth Capital has been in existence for going on 6 years, and it feels like when I do hear politicians speak on the issue, they seem really disconnected from the realities, and the things they say are unimaginative and do not speak to the realities that young people face. Saying you need skills training, that's not the answer. Yes, young people need skills, but we need to bring everybody around the table. We have to talk to the private sector and understand what skills they need and at what level. Not every young person is going to be a coder. So if you want these high-skilled young people, that's going to pipeline, optimistically 20% of unemployed young people now. But what about the other 80%? And we need to think about those layers. It's a really complex problem, but we can't ignore it. It's getting worse and worse. It's not getting any better because, as you say, we failed to really address it in any kind of meaningful way.
There's so many other things to this because, you find, for example, that government will talk about this and then talk about trying to change something. And yet, unemployment is not just our problem, it's a regional problem too. And I don't know what it is that in Southern Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Eswatini, Lesotho, we all have the same problem. But our societies are clearly all suffering from something that's similar.
Yeah, and I think in the South African context, we know that the informal economy and the real rigor and red tape around that provides some kind of barrier to young people entering the labor market. I think where South Africa can distinguish itself from its counterparts on the continent is that we do have an economy that has the potential to create more jobs, I think more so than some of the other places. And also political stability a little bit more than places like Zimbabwe and the other places that you mentioned. But I don't think that we've leveraged that at all. I think that we've been so focused on just kind of getting through that we haven't thought a little bit innovatively and said, well, actually, we do have the power to turn this around. Why are we not thinking about how do we look at the industries that we can leverage both for low skilled, semi-skilled, and high skilled. I say that, again, South Africa, shining light, I'm here in Cape Town, tourism. Why are we not focusing on tourism or the wine sector? We're getting awards left, right, and center. Yet I hear nothing from the tourism sector around how are we, pipelining young people into this kind of industry, which for me seems primed for low skills. You don't need a mathematics degree to, be in the tourism industry. It's always going to be there, particularly, in South Africa. Why are we not thinking about these things? I just think there's so many missed opportunities that we haven't used at all, particularly if you think about the size of Africa in comparison to the other places in sub-Saharan Africa you mentioned.
So people who can't get their first job, say, by the time they're 25, which is a very large number of people, what happens? Does it mean that their chances of getting any form of reliable income, being able to generate that income, is actually very small? I hate to say this, but for the rest of their lives, they really are finding themselves in a situation where it just is going to get harder and harder.
Absolutely. This is the really sad story that we hear in the documentary we released last year with Ewoza, where 8 young people from Kailichi were interviewed. And there's a few in there who say, I'm turning 34 this year, or I'm going to be 35 next year, which means, that documentary was filmed almost 2 years ago. Those young people are not young anymore. And that's, the really sobering message. Young people realize that they don't qualify for these youth job creation programs anymore. And if they haven't managed to get their foot in the door, the likelihood of them doing so is lower. Again, the latest QLFS shows, trends over the last 10 years, and even generally looking at the entire labor force, the number of people that have been looking for work for more than a year has gone up steadily from around, 60% to 10 years ago to nearly 80% now. And then when we look at young people, from our own calculations, I know that 8 in 10 unemployed young people have never had a job. And so we know from research that employers will look at you as a risky hire if you've been out of work for a really long time. Or if you've never had a job, they start to say, why have you never had a job? And they're less likely to hire you, even if the reason you never had a job is nothing to do with your own abilities, but more, the inability of the labor market to create those jobs. And so it really creates a really dire situation. And this is why I keep saying, it's really in the interest of all South Africans, particularly the private sector, to get young people into work. If this generation of young people do not get into a job, do not get into the labor market, do not get into earning, who are going to be your customers? Who are going to be buying your products and your services 10 years from now if we have a large population who are completely unemployed and are basically unemployable because of that lack of work experience?
Kristal Duncan-Williams, thank you. Project lead at Youth Capital. Do appreciate the time.